is Rising Above Stereotypes and Karyotypes, and it's based on what I learned through the process of editing this book, Standing Tall with Turner Syndrome. The women who wrote range in age from late teens to mid-50s, and there's a foreword by Dr. Lynn Levitsky, who's the chief of pediatric endocrinology at Massachusetts General Hospital. She was very supportive through the whole project, and she made sure that all the medical information that I wrote was correct. She and I are the only people writing in the book, or around the essays in the book, who do not have Turner syndrome. Turner syndrome was identified in 1938, 20 years before the development of the karyotype, which I will explain, by an endocrinologist at the University of Oklahoma, Henry Turner. He noted a group of characteristics in 7 women and adolescent girls that included short stature, lack of secondary sexual characteristics, infertility, and a few other symptoms. Since that time, many other signs have been added to the list, though no one has all or most of them. Women and girls with Turner syndrome have a random mutation on one of their sex hormones. There are a number of possible variations, and no clear correlation between the change on that second X or the percentage of second X's that are missing entirely. So this is what a karyotype looks like. So you'll get a little map of all of your chromosomes, and they're numbered 1 through 23, with 23 being the smallest, and if you're a man, an X and a Y, and if you're a woman, 2 X's, or if you have Turner syndrome, maybe the second X is missing, or it's been altered in some way, or some of them are missing in some of your cells, but not in all of them. So if you have a normal set of chromosomes, of any of your chromosomes, you're going to have one from your mother and one from your father, and they look like this because when they do the test, they do it when the cells are at their most compact, just divided. So when they just divided, they divide right along this little line called the centimere. And in some women with Turner syndrome, either the second chromosome is missing completely, either from the mother or from the father, or you could have a repetition of the Q arm of this lower bit. So you'd have 2 Q's instead of a Q and a P. Or you could have 2 P's. But the important thing is that even though you get this little map of yourself, it's very crude because it doesn't tell you which of the symptoms you're going to have. So the chromosomes look kind of funny. They're sort of all bashed up and they're leading in different directions, which would lead, everything looks abnormal. But that's just how they look because of the test, and it's a sort of a violent thing to get the chromosomes out of the cell and line them up. And they only get their numbers, which I only learned through working on this book, by they go from the biggest to the smallest. So number 1 chromosome is because it's the biggest, going all the way down to the sex chromosomes, which are the smallest. So it seemed to me always very mysterious. Ah, chromosome 18. Yeah. But it just means it's 18th in size from number 1. So men, as you know, have only 1 X. So this can only happen to girls, because if you're missing, if you only have 1 X, you can't lose it, because it's not compatible with life. So men can't have Turner syndrome. Turner syndrome is a random mutation, and you don't inherit it from your parents. It occurs once in 2,000 to 2,500 live births of girls all over the world, from every ethnic group, and it doesn't matter how old your parents were, it just happens. The karyotype is the definitive test for Turner syndrome and many other chromosomal conditions. So remember our little map on the page there. It was developed in the 1950s. So this is a very old test, but it's still the definitive test for Turner syndrome. They take blood or another tissue sample, sure, white blood cells, and when they've got 30 or 40, they examine them for obvious abnormalities. And it's explained in layman's terms in the book in the form of a recipe. So what is the application to the ethical society? Well, genetic testing is becoming more and more common in the general population, with commercial companies like 23andMe, that with a cheek swab, if you have a few $100s, you can send it off and get all kinds of genetic tidbits about yourself for a relatively manageable amount. And this will give you also, tells you about your inherited traits and your risk factors. But genetic testing has a dark side. it leads to dangerous assumptions that you will get a certain illness based on a reading of your genetic tea leaves, leading you to make choices that you otherwise might not make. Perhaps excessive paranoid medical testing or excessive risk-taking. Or alternatively, false security that you won't get certain diseases because you're not at high risk for them. And your whole perception of yourself changes when you have this kind of information. A big drawback is the possibility of the effect on your self-image. You can see yourself in a new light as profoundly flawed. As my daughter often says, everyone has something, even if it's not obvious what it is. The karyotype is absolutely necessary in Turner syndrome for the diagnosis, and I am grateful for the wonderful gift of a healthy and normal life that was made possible for my daughter and so many others. The problem that must be guarded against is self-stereotyping. That can be a side effect of seeing what appears to be a blueprint of you. In a way, the genetic information provided by a karyotype for Turner syndrome, as well as other genetic testing, sets up the old philosophical argument of determinism versus free will. This can be seen played out in the approaches of different women in this book to the results of genetic testing and information. Most accounts of life with Turner syndrome focus on the early years. Perhaps this is because that's when the most significant physical adjustments and medical decisions are being made. Growth hormone, female hormone supplements, etc. This approach is natural because there's a lot to assess, decide, and prescribe in the early years, and it's easier to focus on the physical rather than the emotional side of coming to terms with a serious diagnosis. Adult women wrote this book. No writers are under 17, and the majority are over 30, more than 15 years post-diagnosis. It's often the case that parents, and I had to watch for this too, in their zeal to advocate for their children with any number of different conditions, wind up speaking for their children, no matter what their age. This can be especially pernicious with Turner syndrome because the hallmarks of the condition include short stature and delayed puberty. Everyone should assume that short women, including those with Turner syndrome or other people with physical distinctions, are capable of speaking for themselves. Even with the best of intentions, we have to try to be aware of how destructive it can be to infantilize someone because they're short or have another striking physical characteristic. It's a feminist issue also with cuteness and smallness and the tendency of many women to defer to the feelings of others. All these essayists shared their energy and enthusiasm, which enabled me to persist in this project at times when I was overwhelmed by the scope of the work. The outside world spurred me on. When I mentioned to one of my doctors that I have a daughter with TS, she asked me immediately, she blurted out, "Is she retarded?" This was about 6 months ago. Something she learned when she was in medical school only 15 years ago. Many old textbooks still give out this erroneous information. One woman I know told me that before her diagnosis, she learned about TS in high school biology class. She failed to diagnose herself because of the mention of cognitive impairment, because she said, secondary sexual characteristics missing? Check. Really short? Checked. Maybe that's what's wrong with me. And then the teacher said, and they have serious learning difficulties. And she was like, So, as I was explaining to somebody here earlier, that high school biology teachers, they'll talk about some interesting phenomenon from the textbook, and they're not making the connection that the chances when something occurs, 1 in 2,000 live births of girls, if you teach in a big city high school, you probably have 300 to 400 students come through your classroom. The chances that there is a specimen of what you are trying to describe sitting right there in your class are really quite high. Or that they have a sister or a cousin. Because this is not that rare. And even rare doesn't mean that. I learned a lot of things just by gathering the people together. From the breadth of effects that sex hormones have beyond anything that would be defined as sexual, to the effect that a little bit of genetic information can have on a person's perception of themselves and their ability to choose a course in life. Thank you.